The wind came down out of the Bitterroots at 34 below, and it carried the smell of something burning that should not have been burning. Across a mile of frozen meadow, an orange glow pulsed against the low clouds. A cabin was coming down around the family inside it. Deep in a grove no trapper would enter, 300-year-old pines held their breath above a single small window. Yellow light moved behind the frost on the glass. A gloved hand wiped a circle clean. She was 38. She had come 2,000 miles alone. In her handcart, she had carried a coil of copper her dead husband had bought her for whatever she decided to build next. Outside her door, the sky above the settlement was the wrong color. Footsteps struck the clearing, hard, uneven running. The second knock had not landed yet. She was already reaching for her coat. The snow came early to the Bitterroot that year, sliding down from the peaks in soft sheets that no one thought to fear. By the third week of September in 1883, most folks in the valley still walked without gloves. They laughed at the flurries. They stacked their cordwood loose and half-cured, still confident that October would give them another month of grace. They were wrong, though none of them knew it yet, and the woman who would prove them wrong had not yet driven her mule into the clearing. She came in on a Tuesday afternoon alone, pulling a three-wheeled handcart behind an ash-gray mule, so old its lower lip trembled when it breathed. The wheel on the right side had been repaired with baling wire and a length of iron banding, and it wobbled with every rotation, drawing a crooked line in the frost that clung to the wagon road. Behind her stretched nothing but the pale September sky and a set of tracks that led back through 200 miles of prairie forest and river crossings. Ahead of her stood the mouth of the valley, framed by two spurs of Bitterroot granite, and beyond that a scatter of raw cabins, already sending thin ribbons of smoke into the afternoon air. Her name was Winifred Ashcombe, though she had not spoken it aloud to another human being in 14 days. The men at the last trading post had called her ma'am, which was the closest thing to a name she had needed since crossing the Continental Divide. She was 38 years old, tall for a woman of her generation, with a spine that had never learned to soften. Her hair had gone gray at the temples, faster than her mother's, had faster than any of the Ashcombe women before her, though she suspected the mine collapse 2 springs back had done more to whiten it than any inheritance of blood. She wore a wool coat that had once belonged to Nathaniel, still smelling faintly of the coal dust that no washing had ever fully lifted from the weave. Beneath the coat, she wore a plain gray wool skirt that had been cut narrower than fashion allowed, split at the back seam and resewn into something closer to a divided riding skirt, because a woman who meant to shovel could not afford a bell of fabric around her ankles. A knitted shawl was folded twice across her chest under the coat, held in place by a horn button that had come off Nathaniel's Sunday vest. The mule was called Juno. She had bought the animal in Missoula for $7 and a silver locket, and neither party in the transaction had walked away pleased. Juno pulled the cart because Winifred asked her to, not because she wanted to, and the two of them had reached a wordless understanding somewhere east of the Sapphire Range that neither would push the other harder than the day allowed. Juno stopped now at the crest of the road, ears twitching toward the smoke, and Winifred did not urge her forward. She stood beside the cart, one gloved hand resting on the animal's withers, letting the valley reveal itself in its own time. Sable Hollow lay to the west, though she did not yet know its name. From the road it looked like a bruise on the landscape, a dense knot of dark timber that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Around it, the paler stands of lodgepole pine caught the afternoon sun and threw it back in yellow flashes, but the hollow itself stayed cool and blue, as though it kept its own weather. Winifred looked at it for a long time. She had learned to read ground the way some people read faces, and this ground was telling her something the other folks in the valley had chosen not to hear. A man came up the road behind her before she had finished looking. She heard his boots first, the crunch of frost-stiffened grass under a heel that struck harder on the left than the right. When she turned, he was already close enough that she could see the pale scar where his right earlobe had been, the flesh puckered and shiny, the color of old tallow. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself like one chest pushed forward, a rifle slung casually across his back, as though the weight of it were nothing. His name, she would later learn, was Thaddeus Rickford, though everyone in the valley called him Thad, and he had trapped these mountains for 11 winters. He looked at her cart, at her mule, at the copper coil, bound in oilcloth, on top of her bedroll, and his mouth tugged sideways in something that was not quite a smile. "You come to visit somebody, ma'am, or you come to settle?" His voice carried the particular flatness of a man who had asked the same question of many strangers and been disappointed by most of the answers. "Settle." Winifred did not turn her body toward him. She kept her eyes on the dark shape of the hollow. "I mean to build before the ground hardens." He laughed short and dry, the sound of a piece of kindling snapping in a low fire. "Ground's already hardening, ma'am. You'll be laying stones in ice by next week." He shifted the rifle strap on his shoulder. "There's open land near the creek, sun most of the day. My brother-in-law can help you throw up walls in 4 days if the weather holds. Cost you $2 and a share of whatever you shoot come spring." She thanked him without meaning it. Her thanks was the polite currency a woman carried on the frontier the way a man carried a knife, and she spent it because she had to, not because she owed him anything. Then she looked past his shoulder toward the western timber, toward the blue-shadowed knot of trees that pulled at her eye, the way a magnet pulls at iron filings. "That grove yonder, what do folks call it?" Thad's smile lost its remaining humor. He turned his head, spat once into the frost, and rolled his tongue behind his teeth before answering. "Sable Hollow. Nobody calls it much of anything because nobody goes near it. Trees drink the light. Ground stays frozen 10 inches deeper than the rest of the valley. My uncle lost a good hound in there in '71, walked in barking, and walked out silent, and he never barked at anything again till he died. I wouldn't pitch a canvas lean-to in that grove if you paid me my winter's pelts." Winifred said nothing. She had heard variations of that story in every valley she had passed through in the last 2 years, and she had learned to weigh the tellers rather than the tales. Thad Rickford was a man who believed his own warnings, which made him honest, but not necessarily correct. She thanked him again, more briefly this time, and clucked her tongue at Juno. The mule leaned into the harness, and the cart squeaked forward, the bent wheel drawing its crooked line down toward the settlement. She made her camp that first night on the eastern edge of Sable Hollow, close enough to feel it, but not so close as to sleep beneath its branches. She staked Juno to a young cottonwood, spread her oilcloth on packed ground, and built a small fire with kindlings she had gathered from the outer stands of pine. The fire burned cleanly. The smoke rose straight. There was no wind at all, which was itself a piece of information. She filed away because the valley beyond the grove was already whistling with the kind of dry gusts that come down out of the bitterroots in September and do not stop until they have stripped every unripe apple from the branch. Inside the shelter of the hollow's outer trees, the air lay still as pond water. She did not sleep well. Sleep had been an unreliable companion since the spring. The shaft at Rockledge number 3 had given way, and she had long ago stopped expecting it to arrive on schedule. Instead, she lay on her back and listened to Sable Hollow breathe. The great trees creaked in their upper branches, not from wind, but from their own settling weight, from the small adjustments that a 300-year-old pine makes as the temperature drops through the small hours. Somewhere deep inside the grove, an owl called once and was answered by nothing. Winifred pulled Nathaniel's coat tighter around her shoulders and let the smell of coal dust do what it had done every night for 2 years, which was to keep her from feeling entirely alone. Morning found her already awake, the last stars still burning faintly behind the eastern ridge. She untied Juno, gave the mule a handful of dried oats from a canvas bag, and walked into Sable Hollow without her cart, without her tools, without anything but the coat. Her boots and a length of rawhide she had wound around her wrist out of habit. She walked slowly. She stopped often. She was not looking for a home site yet. She was learning the land's vocabulary before she asked it any questions. The trees stunned her. She had grown up around Vermont hardwoods, had watched Nathaniel's brothers fell chestnuts thick enough to hide a horse behind, but she had never stood among trunks of this dimension. Some of the pines in Sable Hollow rose 90 feet before their first live branch. Their bark cracked into plates the size of a man's open hand, dark as wet slate where the frost had not yet touched them. When she pressed her palm flat against the nearest trunk, She could feel a low, slow warmth, the warmth of a body that had spent centuries banking summer heat against the coming cold. She stood there with her hand on the tree for a long moment, and if any of the men down in the valley had seen her, they would have called her a witch or worse. But she did not care because none of them were there, and the tree was. She walked deeper. She noted where the snow from a small overnight flurry had piled and where it had not. She noted that the frost on the ground within the grove sat only in thin lace at the surface, while the frost on the open meadow beyond had crusted a full inch deep already. She noted the angle at which the low September sun struck the eastern face of the largest pine, and she calculated in her head without a pencil how that angle would shift by December. She noted the soft give of the duff beneath her boots, the layered decades of needle fall and moss, the way it insulated the mineral soil from the coldest air. By mid-morning, she had walked a rough circle around what she thought might be the calmest heart of the grove, a small clearing perhaps 20 feet across, where three of the oldest trees leaned toward one another, as though sharing a secret. She stood in the center of that clearing and turned slowly. The wind she could hear moving through the tops of the pines did not reach her here. The temperature felt a full 10 degrees warmer than the meadow she had crossed to reach the trees. She closed her eyes and listened, and what she heard was not silence exactly, but a kind of held breath, the way a room feels when someone has just finished speaking and the listeners have not yet answered. Nathaniel would have laughed at her for standing so long with her eyes closed. He had never possessed patience for what he called her wool gathering, though he had married her precisely because she was the sort of woman who noticed things. On their fourth day of courtship, she had told him that the pump handle at his mother's house was mounted a quarter-inch off true, which was why the leather washer wore out every spring. He had checked. She had been right. From that day forward, he had trusted her eye on any matter of built things, and it was Nathaniel who, 3 months before the collapse at Rockledge, had brought home the coil of soft copper tubing wrapped in oilcloth. He had traded a week's wages for it. When she asked him what it was for, he had said only for whatever you decide to build next, Winnie, because you always build something next. He had said it with the gentle mockery of a husband who did not fully understand his wife, but had learned to make room for her. She opened her eyes. She marked the clearing in her mind with two glances, one at the sun and one at the largest tree, and she walked back to Juneau. The valley settlement lay a mile down the wagon road closer to the creek where Thad Rickford had suggested she build. It consisted of 9 cabins in various stages of construction, a rough corral, a lean-to that served as a communal smokehouse, and a single false-fronted building that would eventually call itself a store, but was at present only a canvas tent stretched over a plank counter. Smoke rose from 6 of the 9 cabins. From the 7th came the ringing of an axe against green wood. From the 8th came a smell of scorched pork fat. From the 9th came a woman's voice singing a hymn she half remembered from her own girlhood, though she could not have said which. She led Juneau through the settlement without stopping. Men looked up from their work. A boy of perhaps 9 ran to the door of one cabin and called his mother out to see the stranger. Winifred nodded to the mother, a thin, freckled woman with a baby balanced on her hip, and kept walking. She had learned in 2 years of moving west that a woman traveling alone had exactly one chance to set the terms of how she was seen, and that chance came in the first hour. She did not smile. She did not stop to explain herself. She let her silence do the work that a man's rifle would have done. At the far end of the settlement, near the last cabin, 3 men were laying up the second course of logs on a fresh foundation. The oldest of them straightened as she passed, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stepped into the road. He was perhaps 45 broad through the shoulders, with a beard the color of a fox pelt, and eyes that had spent too many years squinting into snow glare. He looked her over the way a horse trader looks over a horse. "Orrin Belknap at your service, ma'am." His voice was pitched to carry, and 2 of the other builders had already paused their work to listen. "You come alone." "I have." Winifred did not slow Juneau. The mule kept pulling. The cart squeaked. Belknap walked beside her for 3 paces. "Where do you mean to put down?" "The grove." She did not point. She did not have to. Every man in the valley knew which grove she meant by the way her voice shaped the word. He stopped walking. He did not laugh, not at first. He simply stood there in the road and let her pass him, and when she was 10 feet beyond him, he raised his voice just enough that the other men could hear. That grove will bear you, ma'am. My advice free of charge. Ground won't take a foundation. Trees won't let sun in. You'll be a corpse in that hollow by Christmas, and your mule with you. Winifred kept walking. She did not turn her head. She let his words fall into the road behind her, and she did not pick them up. But she registered them. She cataloged the pitch of his voice, the way he had waited until she was past him, before speaking the way he had said ma'am, like a man setting down a plate he did not care for. Orrin Belknap, she understood already, was not Thad Rickford. Thad had warned her because he believed his warning. Belknap had spoken so that other men would hear him speak. The difference mattered. She would remember it. She camped that second night at the eastern edge of Sable Hollow again, and in the morning she began. She did not begin with a shovel. She began with a stick. She cut a straight length of pine no thicker than her thumb, sharpened one end, and drove it into the ground at the center of the clearing she had chosen. Then she walked 10 paces east and drove another. Then 10 paces north. Then 10 paces west. Then 10 paces south. She stood in the middle of her rectangle of sticks and looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled up the eastern stake and moved it 2 paces closer, because she had noticed that the ground beyond that line dipped very slightly, and any dip meant water, and any water meant frost heave in the spring. Only when the 4 sticks satisfied her did she reach for her shovel. The first day of digging was the worst kind of work, the kind that produces almost nothing to show for a full day's effort. The topsoil in the grove came up easily enough, black and rich, threaded with roots the diameter of her wrist. She cut those roots with a handsaw rather than an axe, because an axe strike would jar the whole tree, and she did not want the trees to think of her as an enemy yet. Below the topsoil, she hit a layer of gray clay so dense it turned her shovel edge on the second stroke. She stopped, sharpened the shovel with a small file she carried in her hip pocket, and kept digging. By dusk, she had opened a pit 4 feet square and 18 inches deep, and her shoulders felt as though someone had beaten them with a fence rail. Thad Rickford came by on the third afternoon. She heard him before she saw him, the uneven crunch of his boots on frost that never quite melted here inside the grove. He stopped at the edge of her clearing and stood with his rifle butt resting on the toe of his boot, watching her work. She was in the pit by then, up to her waist, throwing clay onto a tarp she had spread beside the hole. She did not look up. "You're digging deep, ma'am." Below the frost line. She stopped, straightened, wiped her forehead with the back of a wrist that left a smear of gray clay across her temple. She looked at him steady. "Frost gets to about 4 foot in this country in a bad winter." "I mean to go 5. Thad considered that. She was beginning to understand a man who considered things before he ridiculed them. "Nobody digs a foundation 5 foot deep out here. You'll spend 2 weeks in that hole." "I have 2 weeks." She bent to her shovel again. He watched her another minute. Then he set his rifle against a tree, walked to the edge of the pit, and lowered himself down beside her. He did not ask permission. He did not offer help in words. He simply picked up her spare shovel from where it leaned against the wall of the pit and began to work the opposite corner slowly without conversation. He worked for an hour. When he climbed out at the end of that hour, he brushed the clay from his trousers, retrieved his rifle, touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, and walked away without saying goodbye. He did not come back the next day or the day after. But Winifred remembered the hour. She cataloged it beside his warnings, and she understood something about Thad Rickford that she had not understood the first afternoon, which was that the men who warned you loudest were sometimes the men who most wanted to be proven wrong. By the end of the first week, the pit was 5 feet deep and lined with a bed of river gravel she had hauled from the creek in 6 trips with the handcart. She spread the gravel 8 inches thick, sloped it toward one corner where she had cut a small drain channel, and packed it flat with the back of a shovel. On top of the gravel, she began to lay the clay she had dug out, but she did not lay it the way she had found it. She broke it dried it and kneaded it in small batches with water from the creek and a handful of chopped pine needles for binding. The needles would rot eventually, but by the time they rotted, the clay would have set into something almost like a fired tile, hardened by the heat she meant to run through it. The copper coil came out of the oilcloth on the morning of the ninth day. She had not looked at it since Missoula. She had not looked at it in truth since the afternoon Nathaniel had brought it home, because looking at it had become one of the small acts she rationed. She unwrapped it now, in the bottom of the pit, kneeling on the packed clay, and she let herself see it for what it was, 120 feet of soft copper tubing, coiled tight, dulled to a dark rose by the years, with the small hammer mark on the third loop where Nathaniel had struck it accidentally while carrying it into their kitchen. She touched the mark with the pad of her thumb. Then she began to lay the coil out in the clay, winding it in a slow spiral from the outer edge of the pit toward the corner where she meant to build the stove box. Her hands remembered him as she worked. That was the strange thing about grief, the way it lived not in the head, but in the smaller muscles, the way an unwrapped length of copper could bring back the exact weight of Nathaniel's palm on the back of her neck, the last morning she had seen him leave for the shaft. She kept laying the coil. She did not stop. Grief that could be worked around was grief that could be borne, and she had learned that lesson in the 2 years since Rockledge, whether or not she had wanted to learn it. The boy came on the 11th day. He was small for 9, freckled across the bridge of his nose the same way his mother was, and he carried a biscuit wrapped in a square of blue calico. He stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time before he worked up the courage to speak, and Winifred pretended not to notice him for most of that time because she remembered being 9 and standing at the edges of things. "Ma says you're foolish." His voice piped up thin and clear in the still air of the grove. "She says nobody builds under trees. But my pa says you dug your hole straight, and a woman who digs a straight hole ain't as foolish as she looks." Winifred set down her trowel. She climbed out of the pit, brushed the clay from her palms, and walked to where the boy stood. She was careful not to step too close. Children on the frontier were half wild and half watchful, and she did not want to spook him. "What's your father's name?" "Silas Whitcomb." "My uncle's Merritt. They're building down by the creek, closest cabin to yours, if you count in a straight line. Ma says we're your nearest neighbor whether we want to be or not." His eyes went to the pit behind her, then to the coiled copper, then back to her face. "What's that yellow rope?" "Copper." She let the words sit. "It carries heat. It's going under the floor." The boy considered this with the grave seriousness that only a 9-year-old could bring to a question of engineering. "Under the floor, under the floor." He held out the biscuit. "Ma said to bring it. She said even a fool has to eat." Winifred took the biscuit. It was still warm through the calico. "Tell your mother I said thank you, and tell your father that a straight hole is only the first of the things he can judge me by." She broke the biscuit in half and held out one piece to the boy. He hesitated, then took it, and the two of them ate standing in the clearing while the September light slanted through the pines and turned the coiled copper into something that looked for just a moment like a nest of dark gold. The boy told her his name was Thomas. He asked her 3 more questions and then remembered he was supposed to be helping his mother with the goats and ran off through the trees, biscuit crumbs on his chin, and Winifred stood in the clearing with the taste of another woman's bread on her tongue and understood that she had, without meaning to, made a small alliance. She did not know yet how much that alliance would matter. She only knew that she was, for the first time in 14 days, no longer entirely alone. She finished laying the copper on the 12th day. She capped both ends with wooden plugs for now because she had not yet fabricated the stove box that would connect to it, and she did not want debris in the tubing over the winter of her construction. Over the copper, she laid a second course of packed clay, this one thinner, only 3 inches, and into that clay she pressed a scatter of flat river stones. The stones would hold heat, releasing it slowly upward through the floor even after the fire in the stove had died down. Above the stones went the subfloor of split planks, and above the planks would eventually go the finished floor, but that was still weeks away. While the clay cured, she began to think about walls. She had known from the first afternoon that she would not fell any of the great trees. There were practical reasons the trunks were too thick to work alone, and any single one of them dropped incorrectly would take out three of its neighbors and leave a hole in the grove's canopy that would let the wind in for the next 100 years. But there were reasons beyond the practical. She had walked among these trees for 2 weeks now. She had touched them, listened to them, felt the low warmth of their bark under her palm. She was not a woman who spoke of trees as if they had souls because she had never been given a satisfactory definition of a soul, but she was a woman who understood partnership when she saw it. The trees were offering her their shelter. She would not repay them by cutting them down. So she would build between them. She measured the distances between the four great pines that framed her clearing. The gaps were not regular. The northwest gap was 12 feet, the northeast 14, the southeast 11, and the southwest a scant 9 feet. A conventional builder would have called this ground unusable. Winifred called it a set of instructions. Her cabin would not be rectangular. It would be a slightly skewed trapezoid wider on its eastern face, where the morning sun would enter, and narrower on the west where the winter storms came in. The great trees themselves would form portions of her walls, their trunks incorporated into the corners, their bark left living where it met the interior air. This was the part of the plan she had told no one, because she knew what any man in the valley would say about it. A tree grew. A tree flexed in wind. A tree could not be trusted as part of a wall. She had heard the objections in her head so many times that she no longer needed to hear them from Belknap. But she had done the arithmetic. A 300-year-old ponderosa in this soil moved perhaps a quarter of an inch at its base in a strong wind. Her joinery would tolerate that. She would use no rigid nails at the tree corners. She would use soft copper strap hammered flat that could give in return. She would seal the seams with a pitch and ash compound of her own mixing one that stayed pliable at 40 below, because Nathaniel had once shown her the recipe in his father's workshop notebook, and she had copied it out in her own hand and carried it west folded inside her Bible. She began to cut smaller trees from the outer margins of the grove, the crowded stands of young pine that would benefit from the thinning. She chose them one by one, marking each with a bit of red thread tied around the trunk. She chose only trees that leaned already toward the direction she wanted them to fall. She chose only trees whose loss would open light to 2 or 3 of their neighbors who needed it. She was not, she reminded herself as she notched the first tree, being sentimental. She was being efficient. The forest had its own economy, and she was learning to trade inside it. The first tree came down at 10 in the morning on the 15th day. It fell exactly where she had aimed it. The sound of its fall was smaller than she had expected, muffled by the surrounding canopy, absorbed almost immediately back into the great stillness of Sable Hollow. She stood for a moment beside the fallen trunk, catching her breath, feeling the small tremor of the impact fade out of the ground beneath her boots. Then she took up her draw knife and began to strip the bark. Orrin Belknap came by that afternoon. He came, she understood, because Thomas Whitcomb had gone home the previous evening and told his mother about the copper and the pit and the flat stones, and Silas Whitcomb had mentioned it in the settlement. And word had traveled from cabin to cabin the way word always traveled in a place too small for privacy. Belknap did not come alone. He brought with him a lean young man in a green shirt whose name she did not learn that afternoon, and the two of them walked into her clearing with the deliberate casualness of men who had rehearsed the walk. Belknap's eyes went first to the pit, which was now covered with a tarp weighted at the corners with stones. His eyes went second to the fallen tree, which lay half-stripped beside her. His eyes went third to Winifred herself and lingered. "Building yourself a coffin with windows, ma'am." His voice had the easy cruelty of a man who has said the same line already in his head a dozen times and has come to enjoy the sound of it. "Trees this close, you'll never dry your walls. First cold snap, you'll have ice on the inside of your logs by breakfast. Second snap, you'll have ice in your lungs by supper." Winifred did not stop draw knifing. The curl of bark rose from her blade in a long, clean strip and dropped to the ground at her feet. She let him talk. She had discovered that men like Belknap talk more when they were not answered, and the more they talked, the more they revealed of the shape of their own fear. The young man in the green shirt shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Mr. Belknap, we ought to be getting back." Belknap ignored him. He walked slowly around the perimeter of Winifred's clearing, hands clasped behind his back, examining her stakes, her tarp, her small stack of stripped logs. He stopped at the base of the largest pine, laid his palm flat against the bark, the way she had done in her first walk through the grove, and looked at her over his shoulder. "You mean to build into these trees?" It was not a question. The trees had told him, or the boy had, or his own experienced eye had read her stakes and known. "I do." He shook his head. He turned to the young man in the green shirt. "She means to build into the trees." He said it with the wonderment of a man reporting a curiosity to a colleague. The young man in the green shirt looked at his boots. Belknap turned back to Winifred. "Ma'am, I have built 43 cabins between here and the Yellowstone. I have buried men who built better cabins than you are about to build. When your walls crack this winter, and they will crack, do not send that boy to fetch me. I will not come." His voice had risen slightly. The young man in the green shirt was already backing toward the trees. Winifred set down her draw knife. She straightened. She looked at Orrin Belknap for the first time full in the face, and she let the look last long enough that he understood he had been seen. "Mr. Belknap." Her voice was low, and it did not rise. "I have not asked you for your help. I have not asked you for your counsel. I have not asked you for your good opinion. What I have asked from you is precisely nothing, and it appears that even that is more than you are willing to give. Now, if you have finished admiring my stakes, my mule is tied at the edge of the clearing and would like to be left in peace." Belknap's face went the color of old brick. He opened his mouth, he closed it, he opened it again. Then he laughed one short bark of a laugh that was not a laugh at all, and he walked past her toward the young man in the green shirt with the deliberate stride of a man who has decided to leave rather than been asked to. At the edge of the clearing, he turned back. "Christmas, ma'am," his voice carried. "You have until Christmas." Then he was gone. The young man in the green shirt followed. Winifred stood in the clearing with her draw knife in her hand and the fallen pine at her feet, and she did not move for a full minute. She was not shaking. She had promised herself somewhere east of the Sapphire Range that she would never again let a man in a good coat make her shake. But something inside her was hot in a way she had not felt in a long time, hot and cold at once, and she recognized the feeling as the particular fuel that had carried her through 200 miles of prairie. It was not anger exactly, it was the refusal to be dismissed. She had been dismissed at Rockledge by the mine foreman, who told her there was nothing to be recovered from the shaft. She had been dismissed by the pastor in Vermont, who told her a widow of 36 had no business heading west alone. She had been dismissed at every ferry, every trading post, every crossing between the Green Mountains and the Bitterroots. She had learned that dismissal was a weather. You did not fight it. You built for it. She bent again to her draw knife and finished stripping the log before dark. The days shortened, the nights lengthened. She worked from before first light until the light in the clearing failed, and then she worked another hour by lantern. She slept beside a small fire under a canvas lean-to she had rigged against the base of the largest pine, and each morning she woke to the sound of the grove breathing above her. October came. The frost thickened on the meadow beyond the trees but stayed thin inside the grove. She raised the first course of wall logs, notched them into pockets she had carved directly into the bark of the great pine, sealed the seams with pitch and ash. The soft copper straps she had brought with her went in at each corner, hammered flat, allowing the joint to breathe with the movement of the trunk. She raised the second course 3 days later. She raised the third the day after that. The cabin began slowly to look like a cabin, though it looked like no cabin the men in the settlement had ever seen. Its walls leaned outward at the top by a hand's breadth, following the natural taper of the trees they joined. Its footprint was a skewed trapezoid rather than a square. Its single window opening faced east and was narrow, only 20 inches across, because a wide window was a wide mouth for the cold to enter. The door opening faced southeast, tucked beneath the heaviest overhead canopy so that snow would drop lightly on it, rather than in the drifting sheets that hid any door facing north. Every choice she made was a choice against something Belknap had told her to do. Every choice she made was a choice for something the Grove had told her to do. And she was aware as she worked that she had become for these weeks a translator between two kinds of intelligence. One that had lived here for 3 centuries and one that thought it had only just arrived. She built the vestibule in the second week of October. She framed it as a small outer chamber 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide. Its own outer door hung on iron pinnals she had forged over a small forge of stacked river rock. The vestibule roof sloped hard to the south so that snow would slide off before it could pile. She had learned the principle from an old trader she had met in Bismarck, a man who had built grain sheds in Manitoba as a boy, and had told her over a mug of chicory coffee that no door on the northern plains should open directly onto weather. 2 doors made time. Time was what a body needed when it came in half frozen. She built her vestibule for the knocks she could not yet imagine, though she did not know it in those words yet. She only knew that a door was a promise, and a promise had to have room to be kept. She built the roof over 3 days in the third week of October. She laid the ridge poles closer than any book of frontier carpentry would have advised, 18 inches apart rather than 30, and she chose them for tight grain rather than convenient length. Across the ridge poles, she laid split planks, flattened on one side, overlapped like shingles sealed with the same pitch and ash mixture she had used at the corners. Over that went a layer of birch bark she had peeled in careful sheets from 3 young trees at the edge of the grove, choosing only trees that would recover from the peeling. Over the birch bark went a thin layer of the same fired clay she had used in the floor, spread wet and troweled smooth. Over the clay went a final layer of sod she cut from the meadow beyond the grove, patient squares of grass and root laid so tight that no water could find a seam between them. The finished roof was thick as a man's forearm from underside to top, heavy enough that the ridge poles bowed a little under it, though the bowing was calculated and would take the weight all winter without a further inch of settlement. She did not plant anything on the sod. The sod would sprout by itself in spring wild grasses and clover and whatever the wind had already sown in it. And by the second summer of the cabin's life, the roof would be indistinguishable from the meadow floor a quarter-mile away. Thad Rickford came by again in the last week of October. He came alone. He did not bring a shovel this time. He stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her walls for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different from what it had been that first afternoon on the wagon road. "I have been trapping this country 11 years, ma'am. I know what a cold snap can do to a man in a new cabin." He shifted his weight. His breath rose in the cool air. "I do not know what you are building, but I know it is not what the rest of us are building. And I have been thinking on that." Winifred set down her mallet. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron. She waited. Thad worked his jaw. "When it comes hard," he said finally, "when the first real snap comes down out of the Bitterroots, I would take it as a kindness if you would let me come by. Not to help, not to interfere, just to see." He looked at his boots. "I have a boy back in Missouri I have not seen in 7 years. He is 9 this fall. If a woman alone can build a cabin that stands, then I would like to know how she did it, because there might come a day when I need to build one for him." She looked at Thad Rickford. She looked at the scarred ear, the rifle he had not brought this time, the way he did not meet her eyes but did not look away either. She thought about Nathaniel's copper coil and the boy Thomas in the biscuit wrapped in blue calico. She thought about Orrin Belknap laughing that short, cold laugh at the edge of her clearing. She thought about the great pines around her, patient, silent, 300 years old and older, offering their bark as her walls. "Mr. Rickford, come by whenever you like." He nodded once. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. He turned and walked back through the grove, and she watched him go until his silhouette was swallowed by the pines. Then she picked up her mallet and set the next peg because the light was already going, and she had by her own calendar 4 weeks or so before the first real snap arrived, and she meant to be ready when it did. That night, lying under her canvas beside the low glow of her fire, she heard the wind change. It came down out of the Bitterroots for the first time in earnest, a dry, hard wind that scoured the meadow beyond the trees and set the tops of the great pines swaying overhead. She listened to it move through the canopy for a long time. Down in the clearing at her level, the air did not stir. Her fire burned straight up. Her lantern flame did not so much as tremble. Somewhere in the settlement, a mile below, she knew men were rising to feed their stoves and stuff rags into the gaps where their green logs had already begun to shrink. She pulled Nathaniel's coat over her shoulders and let the smell of coal dust do its work. And just before she slept, she thought, without meaning to think it, that she was building not for herself, but for every widow who had been told to sit down by the fire and let the men do the reckoning. She had done the reckoning. She would keep doing it. The wind could come. Above her, the great pines held. The first hard wind came down the Bitterroot canyons on the 2nd of November, and it came without the courtesy of a warning. Winifred was inside her half-roofed cabin when it arrived, kneeling on the subfloor, with a length of pitch-soaked hemp in her lap, working a seam between two wall logs. She heard it first as a distant hiss, the sound a hot skillet makes when the fat hits it, and then she heard the great pines above her begin to answer. The upper branches groaned. The trunks flexed at their tops, invisible to her from below, and the whole grove made a low sound she had never heard from any forest. A sound like the strings of a piano being pressed all at once without being struck. She set down the hemp. She rose to her feet. She walked to the doorway she had framed but not yet hung with a proper inner door, and she looked out into the clearing. The tarp over her materials was pinned where she had left it. The stack of split shingles waited beside the ladder. Nothing moved. Down in the settlement, a mile away, she knew laundry was already being torn from lines. Canvas walls of half-built lean-tos were tearing loose from their pegs, and someone's cook fire was about to become someone's house fire. Here in the clearing at her level, the air was so still she could hear her own breath rise and settle in her chest. Above her, the pines took the wind. They took it the way a rank of soldiers takes a volley, absorbing it into their braced weight, sending it out sideways into their neighbors and downward into their roots. The air that reached her was not still because the wind was small. The air was still because the trees had already spent the wind before it could arrive. She stood in the doorway a long time. She was not smiling. What she felt was closer to what a doctor feels when a fever breaks in a patient he has treated correctly, a private confirmation of a theory nobody else had believed. The wind blew for 2 full days. On the second afternoon, Silas Whitcomb came up through the grove with his hat pulled down to his eyebrows, his coat buttoned wrong, and a smear of pine tar across the knuckles of his right hand. He was a tall man with a slight stoop, 40 perhaps, and he carried himself with the wary politeness of a person who had grown up being the smaller son in a large family. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and waited to be acknowledged before he stepped in. "Ma'am." His voice was scraped from 2 days of shouting into wind. "My brother Merritt lost the west wall of his cabin yesterday afternoon. Not blown down exactly, just peeled up along the top course and let the weather in. We spent last night with both families in our place." He hesitated. "Thomas told his mother something about your walls, something about how you build into the trees. Ma said I ought to come see." Winifred set aside the wooden peg she had been shaping. She stepped down out of the cabin and crossed the clearing, aware as she walked that Silas Whitcomb was the first man from the settlement other than Thad Rickford who had come to her clearing not to warn her, but to look. That was a shift. She had been catching shifts like this in her peripheral vision for a week now. Small changes in how the boy Thomas talked about her when he came up with biscuits. Small changes in the way a passing trapper on the wagon road tipped his hat instead of turning his head. The wind of the last 2 days had done more work for her reputation than any speech she could have given. She showed him the corner joint. She did not speak more than she had to. She let him put his own hand against the seam where the wall log met the living bark of the pine. Let him feel the soft copper strap she had hammered flat between them. Let him press his palm to the wood inside the cabin and feel that there was no draft coming through. He stood a long time with his hand on the log. When he took it away, his face was different. "You did this alone." His voice had lost the scrape. it had gone quiet. I had the trees. Silas Whitcomb looked up. He looked at the 90 feet of pine trunk that formed the northeast corner of her cabin. He looked at the way she had let the natural taper of the tree become the natural taper of the wall. He looked back at her, and there was a small light in his eyes that she recognized from Thomas, the same freckled honesty that could not disguise what it was thinking. "Ma'am, if you would allow it, I would like to bring my brother up here tomorrow. He needs to see this before he rebuilds." He looked at his boots. He does not have another wall's worth of green logs to waste on a design that will fail. Bring him. She said it without ceremony. Bring him at first light. The trees will be still by then. Silas nodded. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked back down through the grove, and she watched him go and understood that she had, without meaning, to taken her first apprentice or something close to it. She had not asked for this. She had come to Sable Hollow to build one cabin, not to teach. But she was beginning to understand that a building once it stood made an argument whether or not its builder wished to argue. Her walls were about to become a lecture. She would have to decide before winter proper arrived whether she meant to be a lecturer. Merritt Whitcomb came at dawn with his brother, and he was a harder man than Silas. Where Silas stooped, Merritt stood square. Where Silas asked, Merritt inspected. He walked the perimeter of her cabin twice without speaking. He knelt at each of the 4 tree corners. He pressed his knuckle against the pitch and ash seal in 3 places and left 3 shallow dents that filled themselves back in within a minute. He climbed onto the subfloor without asking her leave. He stood in the center of her cabin with his hands on his hips and looked up at the underside of the partial roof, and he did not speak for 4 full minutes. When he came down, he did not look at her. "I have been building for 21 years. His voice was flat. "Started when I was 14 helping my father raise a barn in Illinois. I have not seen work like this. Not one time." His jaw worked. "I would not have thought a woman could do it. That is the truth of what I would not have thought, and I will speak the truth of it because you deserve better than a comfortable lie." Winifred did not answer. She had learned in 14 days of not speaking her name aloud that some of the most honest things a person said were the things they did not need an answer to. Merritt looked at her, then straight on. "Ma'am, my cabin is coming down. Not from the wind, though the wind started it. From my own bad joinery. I meant to patch it. I see now that patching it will only cost me the same wall next winter and the winter after." He shifted his weight. "I would like to rebuild. I would like to rebuild the way you have built." He hesitated over the next words as if they cost him something. "I do not know how to ask a woman to teach me. I have never had to." "You have just done it," Merritt breathed out. Some of the squareness went out of his shoulders. He nodded once, small and slow. He did not thank her because he was not a man who thanked easily, and she was not a woman who required thanks. What passed between them in that clearing was not gratitude. It was the beginning of a working agreement, and she recognized it because she had watched Nathaniel and his brothers begin 100 working agreements over 100 kitchen tables, and the shape of the moment was the same, whether the parties were kin or strangers or one woman and 2 Whitcomb brothers standing on a subfloor of split pine at the base of a 300-year-old tree. Word traveled after that. Silas told his wife. His wife told the woman at the next cabin. The woman at the next cabin told her husband. Within a week, Winifred had received 3 more visits from men she had never spoken with, each of whom stood a respectful distance at the edge of the clearing before asking to come nearer, each of whom left with the same look on his face that Merritt had worn. She showed them what she could. She did not show them everything. Some of what she had done was too idiosyncratic to be copied tied too closely to the specific gift of these specific trees, and she did not want a man to walk away thinking he could build her cabin in the middle of an open meadow and have it stand. She spoke plainly about the principles. She spoke plainly about what could be adapted. She sent them home with sketches on birch bark and she pressed her thumbprint into the corner of each sketch, small and deliberate, though she could not have said why she started doing it. It felt like a signature that was not a name. Orrin Belknap heard, of course. He had to. The settlement was too small for a rumor to survive more than 2 days without reaching every ear in the valley, and by the middle of the second week of November, her rumor had grown legs. He came up to her clearing on a cold gray morning with two men she recognized as being the ones who had been laying up his log courses when she first walked past. He did not bring the young man in the green shirt this time. That was the shape of a man who had decided to bring witnesses of a different kind. She was on the roof when he arrived. She had finished the ridge beams and was laying the first course of split shingles across the sod, working from the eastern eave inward, her legs braced against a cleat she had nailed to the pitch. She saw him before he saw her. She did not climb down. She kept working. If Orrin Belknap wanted a conversation with her, he could have it while she nailed shingles. "You have been holding audiences, ma'am." His voice carried up to her flat and dry. "3 men from my own crew have come to me this week asking about tree corners and copper straps." He gave the same short, cold bark he had given at the end of their first meeting. "I told them what I told you. Trees crack. Copper bends. Winter does not forgive novelty." Winifred set her hammer down on the shingle beside her. She looked down at him from the roof. The distance flattered neither of them, but it flattered him less. "Mr. Belknap, what have you come to say that you have not already said?" He did not like being spoken to from above. She saw the color come up his neck the way it had come up at the end of their first meeting. But he was better prepared this time. He had thought about this conversation on the walk up from the settlement, and he had arranged his words in advance. "I have come to say, ma'am, that when your cabin fails, and it will not fail alone. There are 3 families in this valley now planning to build the way you have built on your word and no other. When the first real snap comes and the first tree corner splits and the first family freezes, that will be on your account, not mine." He paused. He had rehearsed the pause. "I did not come to argue with you. I came to tell you that I have offered every family in this valley my crew's labor at fair rates to build proper cabins on cleared ground. Any family that accepts my offer will be safe. Any family that follows you will be gambling their children on your pride." The 2 men behind him did not look at her. They looked at their boots. That was also interesting. Winifred picked up her hammer. She waited in her hand a moment. She spoke without looking at him. "Mr. Belknap, I have not asked any family in this valley to follow me. Silas Whitcomb came to me because his brother's wall came off in the wind. Merritt Whitcomb came to me because his hands know bad joinery when they touch it. I did not knock on any door in the settlement. I did not walk through the wagon road claiming I could save anybody. I dug a hole in the ground, laid stones in it, put walls around it, and the people who wanted to see what I had done came to see it of their own accord. You call that pride. I call it a room that leaves its latch on the outside." She set the hammer to the next shingle. "Now if my roof fails this winter, I will be under it. If yours fails, so will you. That is the only fairness this country offers, and I did not invent it." She struck the nail. The sound of it was crisp and small in the clearing, and it ended the conversation more efficiently than any words she could have used. Orrin Belknap stood a moment longer. He looked at the 2 men behind him. He turned. He walked back down through the grove. The 2 men followed one of them, the shorter one looking back once at her cabin and then quickly away. She kept nailing shingles until the light failed. That night, she sat inside her cabin for the first time with all 4 walls up the roof half shingled. The door hung on its mortised iron brackets. She had not yet built the stove. She had not yet connected the copper coil beneath the floor to a fire. She sat on an overturned crate in the near dark, and she listened to the grove settle around her, aware that Orrin Belknap's visit had done something to her chest that she did not want to examine too closely. It was not fear. Fear was a currency she had spent down to nothing 2 years ago in the mud beside a collapsed mine shaft. It was closer to weariness. The weariness of a woman who had come 2,000 miles to be alone and was discovering that a person who built anything well could not remain alone, that the building itself would gather people, would collect their hopes and their doubts, and their small resentments would become in effect a mouth that spoke for her whether she wished to speak or not. She had wanted only shelter. She was ending up whether she meant to or not with the following. She spoke Nathaniel's name aloud in the dark. She had not done that in months. His name came out of her mouth and hung in the still air of the cabin as if it had been waiting there for her to arrive. She did not follow it with anything. She let it sit small and complete, and after a while she said only into the dark, "I did not come out here to lead men, Nathaniel." He would have known what she meant. He would have laughed the low laugh that had first made her look up from her sewing when she was 22 years old, and he was a stranger sitting across her mother's kitchen table. He would have said, "Winnie, you never came anywhere, that you did not lead men whether you meant to or not." It was not a comforting thought, but it was a true one, and she had learned in 2 years that true thoughts, however uncomfortable, were the only kind that would keep her upright through a hard winter. She built the stove box the next day. She built it out of iron plates she had salvaged from an abandoned wagon bed she had found half buried in the meadow east of the settlement, the wreckage of somebody's failed crossing 3 or 4 years back. She had hauled the plates up in 2 trips with the handcart. She riveted them into a firebox 18 inches deep, 24 inches wide, with a hinged door of her own forging and a flue collar size to the vertical section of copper she had reserved for the chimney run. The chimney itself would not be copper for its full length. Copper was too soft to survive years of hot smoke without warping. She would use it only for the first 6 feet above the firebox, where the heat exchange with the buried floor coil would happen. Above that, she had a length of proper black iron flue pipe she had traded a Vermont pocket watch for at a foundry in Bozeman. And above that, she had a hollowed section of pine trunk sealed inside with fired clay that would carry the last of the smoke up through the roof and out above the grove's canopy. The connection between the firebox and the buried floor coil was the joint she was most worried about. She sweated it with lead tin solder over a small brazier of hardwood coals, working slowly, testing each seam by breathing across it and watching for the smallest flicker of an escaping wisp. She was not a professional metalworker. She had learned everything she knew about soldering from Nathaniel's father, who had been a tinsmith in Rutland before the war, and who had taken his son's new wife into his shop one winter afternoon and shown her how to read a solder joint by the color of the metal after it cooled. She could still hear the old man's voice in her ear. "If the seam looks like a dull penny, Winnie, it will hold. If it looks like a bright penny, it will fail." She stared at each of her seams by lantern light until the metal cooled. Every one of them looked like a dull penny. She would trust the old man's voice because she had trusted it for 18 years and it had not misled her yet. She lit the first fire on the 18th day of November. She lit it small. She fed it slow. She sat cross-legged on the floor of her cabin with her palms pressed against the packed clay, and she waited. The floor was cool at first. Then it was less cool. Then it was in a way she had not felt on any floor she had ever knelt on in Vermont or Missouri or Montana territory warm. The warmth came up through her skirts. It came up into her wrists. She sat with her hands on the clay for a long time, and if any of the men in the settlement had walked in, they would have seen a widow praying, though what she was doing was not prayer, or was not any prayer they would have recognized. She was witnessing. She was letting the floor tell her that Nathaniel's copper coil had done exactly what she had hoped it would do. She was letting the small hammer mark on the third loop stay hidden under the clay, warm now, warm at last, 3 years after the hand that made it had gone still. She wept for the first time in the cabin. Not for long. She did not have time for long, but she wept without shame because there was no one to see her, and because the tears felt cleaner than the ones she had not shed in 2 years. Then she wiped her face with the back of her wrist, and she went outside to bring in more wood, because the night was going to be cold, and the fire, however small, had begun. The first cold snap arrived 4 days later. It arrived in the manner of these Bitterroot snaps without buildup. The wind died at 3 in the afternoon. The sky went the color of a pewter plate. The temperature, which had been a mild 20 degrees at noon, began to fall so fast that Winifred could feel it in her ears as she carried a load of split birch across the clearing. By 5 o'clock, it was 10 below zero. By 7 o'clock, it was 20 below. By 10 o'clock, when she banked her stove for the night and lay down on the sleeping platform she had built along the back wall, the thermometer nailed to the outside of her doorframe read 32 below, and the mercury inside the glass had drawn itself down into a thin dark line that looked in the lantern light like a signature. Inside her cabin, the brass thermometer she had hung on the interior wall read 68 degrees. She did not sleep. She lay on her back on the sleeping platform wrapped in Nathaniel's coat and two wool blankets, and she listened to her cabin. She was not listening for it to fail. She was listening for it to hold. The two sounds were different. A failing cabin popped and creaked inside in ways that a person who had spent enough winters in wooden buildings could learn to distinguish the small betrayals of green joinery, giving up its water, the little groans of a ridge beam settling under snow load. It had not been dried to bare. Her cabin did not make those sounds. Her cabin made a low, steady breath, the breath of a body sleeping, and behind that breath she could hear the deep, patient stillness of the pines that formed her corners. Somewhere down the valley, in the third hour of the deep cold, she heard a tree explode. It was a sound she had never heard before and would not forget. A trunk somewhere in the settlement, one of the young pines that grew out in the open ground where the frost went deep, had frozen its sap so hard and so fast that the wood itself had split. The sound reached her in the cabin as a single sharp report, like the discharge of a large-bore rifle at close range, followed by a long silence, and then a distant rustle as the split trunk's upper branches came down through its neighbors. Somewhere a dog began barking. The barking went on for a long time. Then it stopped, though she could not tell whether it stopped because the dog had been brought inside or because the cold had reached it. She did not go to the door. She could do nothing for anyone in the settlement that night that they could not do better for themselves. She had learned in 2 years of watching men die that the woman who ran toward every emergency became the woman who arrived at none of them in time. She had also learned that the woman who kept her own house standing gave the neighborhood a place to run to. Both of those lessons applied tonight. She lay on the sleeping platform, and she listened, and she did what she could, which was to keep her own fire fed low and steady, so that, when the neighborhood came, if it came, the entry would open on warmth. Something woke her at 3:30 in the morning, though she had not known she was asleep. It was a smell first thin and wrong, carried in on the barest edge of a draft that should not have existed inside her cabin. Smoke, not her smoke. Her stove smoke rose clean and went where it was meant to go. This was different, harsher, greener, the smoke of wet pine burning too fast in an unlined flue. She sat up. She was at the small east window before her feet remembered they were bare on the cold clay. She wiped the frost from the inside of the glass with the heel of her palm, and she looked out. The sky above the settlement was orange, not sunrise. Sunrise would not come for another 3 hours. This was a low orange, close to the ground, pulsing in the way fire pulses when wind hits it. She could not see the source through the trees, but she could see the shape of the light on the underside of the clouds, and the shape of it told her enough. Somebody's cabin was burning. In this cold, which meant somebody's cabin was burning down around the family inside it, because a fire started in a stove at 34 below zero did not politely stop when it reached the wall. She pulled her boots on, with her fingers stiff from the window. She reached for Nathaniel's coat, then stopped and reached instead for the heavier bearskin she kept folded at the foot of the sleeping platform, the one she had traded a copper cookpot for in the Yellowstone country the summer before last. She wrapped it over the coat. She lit the second lantern. She was already moving toward the vestibule when she heard footsteps outside on the clearing, hard and fast and uneven, the run of a man who had run further than his legs were ready for. She was up and at this door before the second knock landed. She opened the outer door of the vestibule, closed it behind the man who staggered in, and did not open the inner door for a full count of 10. She had built the vestibule for exactly this. She had built it, she realized as she waited out the count, for the man now standing in front of her, whoever he turned out to be. He was Thad Rickford. His scarred right ear was black. His left ear was gray. His mustache had frozen into a single stiff line across his upper lip, and when he tried to speak, he could not because his jaw had locked. Winifred did not ask him questions. She opened the inner door. She guided him through by the elbow, sat him on the crate beside the stove, unwound the scarf from his throat with the practiced quickness of a woman who had once helped her husband's brothers out of frozen coats on a Vermont porch in a February blizzard. She poured him a mug of water she had kept warm on the stove's back plate. She did not give him coffee. She did not give him whiskey, though she had a small bottle. Coffee and whiskey were what men reached for when they wanted to feel better. Warm water was what a body needed when it wanted to live. He drank in small swallows. His jaw thawed slowly. The color came back into his lips before it came back into his ears. When he could speak, he did not thank her. He said instead in a voice that was mostly rasp, the Whitcombs, "Merritt's place. It has gone up." Winifred did not move. She waited for the rest. Thad set the mug down. His hand was steady enough now that the mug did not clatter. His flue froze over. He tried to open the firebox to clear it. Whole draft reversed. Smoke came into the room. He kicked the ash bucket, getting to the door. The coals hit the pallet where his wife was sleeping, and the pallet went up before either of them could reach it. His wife's alive. She got out through the window. Their girl, too. Merritt has burns on his hands and his shirt is half gone, but he is walking. Silas's cabin held the four of them last night. It cannot hold them another night. Silas has his own wife and Thomas already inside those walls, and the wife has a cold on her chest and Thomas is coughing, and the smoke that came off Merritt's place in the last hour has drifted down the creek, and every soul in that cabin is breathing it. Winifred stood. She was already reaching for her mittens for the second lantern she kept by the door for exactly this reason. She stopped with her hand on the lantern. She turned to Thad Rickford. She looked at his ears, at his hands, at the way he was holding the mug now, with both hands cupped around it, as though it were the only warm thing in the world. "Mr. Rickford, you are not going back out." She said it without cruelty. "You will lose those ears if you go back out, and you will lose fingers besides, and I will have 2 casualties instead of 1. You will stay in this cabin. You will keep the fire fed. You will open the door for me and any other soul who comes to it tonight. That is your job. I am going down to Silas's, and I am going to bring back whoever can walk." He tried to argue. His mouth opened around the word ma'am, the word that had been the currency of her polite refusals for 2 years, and she watched the word die on his tongue as he understood that this was not a refusal she was offering. This was an assignment. He closed his mouth. He nodded once. He set the mug down. He rose and walked to the door and took his position beside the stove with the stiff obedience of a man who had spent enough of his life in bad weather to know when he was being sent to the right post. Winifred wrapped her scarf twice around her face. She pulled the bearskin close over Nathaniel's coat. She lit the lantern from the stove and let the flames settle. She stepped out into the vestibule, closed the inner door behind her, opened the outer door only when she could feel that no draft was crossing between them. Then she stepped out into the cold, and the cold hit her the way a hand hits an open palm, hard and flat and honest. The clearing was silver. The moon had come up while she slept. The small hours of the morning had cleared the sky entirely, and every needle on every pine in the grove was rimmed in white so bright it hurt her eyes. Her breath crystallized on the wool of her scarf before it had traveled a foot from her mouth. She lifted the lantern high and started down through the grove toward the wagon road. The going was harder than she had expected, not because of the snow, which was only ankle-deep in the grove and knee-deep on the meadow beyond, but because the cold itself was a wall she had to push through. Every inhalation caught in her throat. She learned within 100 yards to breathe through the scarf and not around it. She learned within 200 to swing her arms as she walked to keep the blood moving in her fingers. She had walked in cold before in Vermont and in Missouri and in the crossing of the Continental Divide, but she had never walked in cold like this. This was a cold that did not want anything from you. It did not want to kill you. It did not want to spare you. It simply was the way granite simply was, and you moved through it or you did not. She crossed the meadow toward the creek. The orange light of Merritt's cabin had gone gray now, only a low glow, where the ruin of the north wall still smoldered under snow. The wind had blown across it. She smelled the fire before she saw the shape of it, wet pine and scorched wool, and something else she did not want to name. She did not stop at the ruin. She kept moving towards Silas's cabin, whose small window glowed yellow behind a cloth someone had hung to keep in the heat, and she was 50 feet from the door when the door opened and a shape stepped out to meet her. It was Silas himself. He had a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, and he was in his shirt sleeves, which meant he had heard her coming and had not stopped to put on a coat, which meant something inside was worse than his own comfort could wait on. "Ma'am?" His voice was raw from smoke. "Ma'am, thank God. Thomas is bad. The cough turned in the last hour. He cannot get a full breath. Ma is worse. Merritt's wife has burns to her forearm that Merritt has not been able to look at yet because his own hands are shaking. Our girl has stopped talking." His voice broke once and steadied. "I did not know where to send." Winifred did not answer him with words. She stepped past him into the cabin, ducking her head under the low lintel, and she took in the room the way she took in a piece of ground she meant to build, on the way she had taken in the clearing in the grove 8 weeks before. A single low fire in a poorly drawing stove. Smoke pooled at the ceiling because there were no vents, only 2 small chinks under the eaves. 6 bodies in a room built for 3. Silas's wife on the pallet nearest the fire with Thomas curled against her chest, both of them coughing. Merritt on a stool in the corner with his hands wrapped in a scorched shirt he had used as a bandage, his face gray. His wife Hannah beside him on the floor with her right forearm cradled in her lap, blistered from wrist to elbow, refusing to look at it. The daughter, a girl of perhaps 6, with hair the color of new straw, sitting bolt upright against the far wall, with her eyes open and unfocused, saying nothing. Winifred set her lantern on the table. She spoke without raising her voice because a raised voice in a room this frightened would push the wrong direction. "We are moving. All of you, now. My cabin is a mile up. It is warm, the air is clean. The stove pulls right and the walls do not smoke." She looked at Silas. "Bundle Thomas in the top quilt on that pallet. Do not unwrap him. Do not stop to change him. Carry him under your coat inside your shirt skin to skin and walk beside me." She looked at Merritt. "Your wife walks on my other side. I will carry her arm above her heart the whole way." She looked at the girl. She crossed to her knelt and did not touch her at first. "Sweetheart, what is your name?" The girl's eyes drifted to Winifred and did not focus. Her mouth moved. No sound came out. "Her name is Ivy Hannah," whispered from the floor. "She has been like this since the smoke." "Ivy." Winifred kept her voice low. "Ivy, I am Winifred. I am going to pick you up and you are going to close your eyes, and when you open them, you will be in a warm room with a bright wall and a hot stove, and I will give you a mug of water and a piece of bread with butter on it, and this cold night will be over. Can you close your eyes for me?" The girl's eyelids came down slowly as if she had heard the words from a great distance. Winifred lifted her. She weighed almost nothing under the 2 quilts they had wrapped her in. Winifred wrapped her again in the bearskin off her own shoulders because the bearskin would hold the girl's body heat against her ribs for the mile, and Winifred herself had the wool coat and the walking to keep her going. She turned to Silas's wife, whose name she had never been told, and did not now ask because a name in this moment would slow them down. "Ma'am, you are the last out the door. Take that iron off the stove with a rag, put it in a pot, and carry the pot in the crook of your arm. It will warm the child on the way. Do you hear me?" The woman nodded. Her eyes were red from smoke and something else. She nodded again as if to convince herself. They went out into the cold in a small, ragged line, Winifred at the front, with Ivy in her arms, Silas behind her, with Thomas inside his coat, Merritt and Hannah in the middle, with Hannah's burned arm cradled against Merritt's chest, Silas's wife bringing up the rear with the pot and the hot iron. Nobody spoke. The lantern made a small yellow circle on the snow ahead of them. The moon made a larger blue circle over all of them. Somewhere behind them, the last coal in the ruin of Merritt's cabin gave a small sigh and went out. The walk back took 40 minutes. It should have taken 20. But Silas fell twice with Thomas inside his coat, and Merritt had to stop 3 times to breathe through the pain in his hands, and Winifred stopped once at the outer edge of the grove and adjusted her hold on Ivy and spoke into the child's ear low, the way she had spoken to Juno the first day she bought her. Ivy, we are almost there. There is a door coming, and behind the door is another door, and behind that door is a room where you will not be cold again tonight. Stay with me. The child did not answer, but her small gloved hand closed around the collar of Winifred's coat, and the closing of it was a piece of information Winifred filed carefully because it meant the girl was still there behind her eyes and could still choose to hold on. Thad Rickford opened the outer door of the vestibule before they reached it. He had been watching. He took Ivy from Winifred's arms the moment they were inside, and Winifred watched him do it. And she saw for the second time that night the small, competent hands of a man who had once been somebody's father. He carried Ivy to the folded quilt beside the stove, where he had laid Elias. No, not Elias. That was not tonight, and she caught herself. Tonight there was no Elias tonight. There was Ivy. And she gathered the 2 nights together in her chest and kept moving because a builder in a full house did not stop to sort her feelings until the last body was warm. They filled the cabin. Silas laid Thomas on the sleeping platform with the boy still wrapped inside his coat, then slowly opened the coat and let the room's warmth reach the child by degrees. Winifred went to work on Hannah's arm, which was the worst injury and the one most likely to turn if it was not cleaned tonight. She had linen wraps in a tin box under the platform, and she had a small stoneware jar of lard and honey salve she had made in September from the bees a Vermont neighbor's daughter had sent west with her. And she had, most importantly, hot water, because the stove had been running low and steady all night, and hot water for a burn was the difference between a scar and a rot. She poured cool water first, then warm again, working the heat up by degrees so the shock would not send Hannah into faint. Hannah did not faint. She did not cry either. She sat on the crate with her jaw set, and she looked at the wall log opposite her. And Winifred understood that Hannah was watching the wood as a way of not watching the arm. Merritt sat on the floor beside his wife with his own hands cupped in his lap. Winifred left the burned hands for last because they were less dangerous than the arm, and because Merritt had already spent 3/4 of an hour ignoring them and could spend another 20 minutes. She went to Thomas next. She sat beside the boy on the platform and put her palm on his forehead, and it was hotter than a 9-year-old's forehead should be, but the heat was fever, not fire, and fever was something a warm room and clean air and time could work on. Ma. His voice was small. He had opened his eyes. His mother had been on his left, and she was so tired from the walk that she had not seen his eyes open. Ma, where? Winifred took his hand. She spoke low the way she had spoken to Ivy in the meadow. Your ma is here. She is right there beside you. You are in my cabin, Thomas. You remember. You brought me a biscuit here. His eyes moved to her face. He looked at her for a long moment, and then something like the shadow of a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. Under the floor. His voice was a thread, the yellow rope. Under the floor, she said. Warm now. Go to sleep. It will hold. He closed his eyes. His mother on the other side of him began to weep the small, tight sobs of a woman who had used up her loud weeping in the walk and had none left for indoor use. The cabin held 9 people that night. Winifred, Silas's wife, Thomas Merritt, Hannah, Ivy, Thad Rickford, and the memory of Nathaniel Ashcombe, whose coil beneath the floor was doing exactly what he had said it would do the afternoon he had brought it home from a shop in Rutland 18 months before he died. Nobody spoke much. The stove burned low. The floor beneath their feet stayed warm. The brass thermometer on the interior wall did not move. Outside, the great freeze went on doing what it did, and somewhere in the far reach of the grove, another young pine at the edge of the meadow gave up its sap with a single sharp report, and none of the sleepers in Winifred's cabin woke. Ivy came back to herself an hour before dawn. Winifred was the one who noticed. The girl was still wrapped in the bear skin on the folded quilt where Thad had laid her, and her eyes opened, and this time they focused and they found Winifred's face across the small room and rested there. Ma'am, Winifred crossed to her, knelt, took her small hand. Yes, Ivy, you said butter. Winifred laughed once, a small sound that surprised her more than it surprised the child. She stood, cut a slice from the loaf on the crate, spread it with the butter she had traded for at the settlement store the week before, and brought it to the girl. Ivy ate it slowly, chewing in the deliberate way of a child who had been told her whole short life not to gulp. When she had finished, she looked at Winifred again. Your house talks. Her voice was small but no longer thin. When I was closing my eyes on the walk, I could hear it. It said we would be all right. It sounded like a big animal breathing. Winifred did not know what to say to that. She only nodded, and she brushed a crumb from Ivy's chin, and she thought that Silas Whitcomb's wife had been right 9 weeks before she had ever met her, and that a child of 6 could hear what a grown man had needed a piano string wind to teach him. The second knock came at 6:30 when the sky above the grove had begun to gray behind the eastern ridge. It was not one knock, but 3, quick and hard, the knock of a person who had been running and had not stopped running when they reached the wood. Thad Rickford was on his feet before Winifred was. He had appointed himself the doorkeeper of her vestibule sometime in the night without either of them discussing it, and he pulled the outer latch and stepped back and let a woman in a shawl fall into the small space with both her hands red raw from the cold. The woman was Ruth Belknap. She did not look at Winifred at first. She looked at the inner door as though the thing she wanted was on the other side of it, and everything else in the world could wait. Thad closed the outer door behind her and stood a moment, letting the vestibule do its work. And Ruth Belknap breathed twice, 3 times, each breath ragged, before Winifred opened the inner door and let her through. Ruth had not come for a son. Winifred understood that the moment Ruth stepped in and her eyes swept the room and did not stop at any of the sleeping figures on the floor. Ruth had come for something else. Her eyes came to Winifred and stopped there and did not move. Ma'am, Ruth's voice was tight and small. My husband is out at Merritt's ruin with 2 of his crew. He has been out since 4 in the morning. He learned about the fire from a boy who ran up the wagon road with the news, and he went down before he was fully dressed, and he has not come back. Ruth's jaw worked. Elias, our son, went with him. Elias is 17. His father told him to stay in the vestibule of our own cabin and hand out water to anyone who came. But Elias could see his father was not going to be all right if the fire kept him too long, and Elias went after him. Ruth's voice broke once and steadied. Both of them are out there. My husband is not dressed for what the day is going to be. The wind is turning. I could feel it turning as I came up the grove. Winifred looked at the small east window. She had not looked at it in an hour because she had been busy with Hannah's arm and Thomas's fever and Ivy's butter. She looked now. The sky above the ridge, which had been graying towards sunrise a moment ago, was not graying anymore. It had darkened. A high, thin cloud had come in from the northwest and swallowed the last of the moon, and the small tremor of the pine boughs above the clearing told her that Ruth was right, that the wind was turning, that another wall of cold was coming down out of the Bitterroots and would arrive within the hour. Ruth? Winifred kept her voice level. I am going down. I will bring them back. You will stay here with the others. There is a girl on that quilt named Ivy who needs a woman to sit beside her when she wakes again. You will be that woman. Ruth nodded. She did not argue. She was Winifred saw a woman who had spent enough years managing a man's pride to recognize the shape of a decision that had already been made. Winifred put on her mittens. She did not put on the bearskin this time because the bearskin was still around Ivy. She took a horse blanket from beside the sleeping platform, folded it once, and carried it over her shoulder because a man too proud to leave a ruin was a man who might need to be wrapped in something before he would walk. She looked at Thad Rickford. Same post, Mr. Rickford. Do not let anyone out of this cabin no matter what they say. He nodded once. He did not need the words this time. She went out into the vestibule. She counted to 10. She went out into the yard. The wind was already colder than it had been an hour ago, and the eastern sky had a strange yellow tint to it that she did not like. She had seen skies like that once before in her second winter west, in a valley near the Snake River, and the sky had preceded a blizzard by 4 hours. She did not have 4 hours. She had at most 90 minutes to reach the ruin of Merritt's cabin, find 2 men, and bring them back before the weather closed the wagon road behind her. She went down the grove at a half-run. The cold burned in her chest by the time she reached the meadow, but she had learned in her first cold walk of the night how to breathe through wool, and she kept moving. She saw the ruin of Merritt's cabin before she saw Orrin Belknap. It was a black square and the white meadow edges collapsed. The ridgepole snapped and jutting up like a broken rib. Beside it, 2 figures moved slowly in the pre-dawn light, one bent, one straight, both of them ash-gray from head to boot. Orrin Belknap looked up when she came within 20 yards. He did not speak. He did not straighten. He was pulling something from under a beam, a small trunk that had been pushed against the west wall of the cabin before the fire had reached it, a trunk that must have held something the Wickhams could not afford to lose. His face when he looked at her was not the face of the man who had told her the grove would bury her. It was the face of a man who had spent 2 hours in his shirt sleeves at 34 below and had stopped being able to feel his own hands. "Mr. Belknap." Winifred did not stop walking. She unfolded the horse blanket as she came. "Your wife is at my cabin. Your son is here somewhere. We are going home now." Orrin Belknap tried to speak. His jaw did not work. He shook his head one small motion and lifted the small trunk to show her, and she understood that he had come out for the small trunk because the small trunk belonged to Hannah Whitcomb's daughter Ivy, and that Ivy was 6 and that a man could not go home in front of his own crew without having tried to save the child's small trunk of things. She took the trunk from him. It weighed almost nothing. She tucked it under her arm. She threw the horse blanket over Orrin's shoulders and pulled the corners tight and knotted them at his throat. She looked past him for Elias. The boy was on the far side of the ruin, kneeling in the snow beside something Winifred did not want to look at closely because from 20 feet away, it had the shape of one of the crewmen who had come with Belknap, and it was no longer moving. Elias's shoulders were shaking, and he was rocking slightly, and he was 17 years old, and Winifred understood that Elias had been the first to reach the man and had not yet been able to stand up from what he had found. She left Orrin with the blanket. She crossed to the boy. She knelt beside him, and she did not touch him at first, because a boy who had just seen his first frozen dead man did not need a hand on his shoulder before he had been asked whether he wanted one. "Elias." The boy did not look up. "Elias, your father is on his feet. He is going to walk home with us in about 1 minute. He is going to need you to walk beside him. This man here is not going to stand up. There is nothing you can do for him now that will change what has already happened. There will be time later to sit with what you have seen. There is not time now." Elias looked up. His face was wet. He was not crying anymore. His face was wet because the tears had frozen on his cheeks and were now melting from the small warmth of his skin. He looked at Winifred. His mouth moved. "He was our foreman. He worked for us 7 years. Elias's voice was very small. His name was Bram Halloran. He came down from the crew shed to help. I am sorry, Elias, truly. Come stand up." She got him to his feet. She led him across to his father, who was still standing where she had left him. The horse blanket knotted at his throat. She put Elias on Orrin's left side. She took Orrin's right elbow. She spoke without looking at either of them. "We walk. We do not stop. We do not talk. If either of you slows down, I will speak sharply, and I want you to understand in advance that the sharpness is not because I am angry. It is because we do not have the minutes to spend on politeness." "Yes." Orrin nodded. Elias nodded. They walked. The wind came in behind them by the time they were halfway across the meadow. The yellow sky had darkened to gunmetal. Snow began to fall, not the fat, friendly flakes of an easy storm, but the small, hard grains of a real blizzard, and Winifred realized within a quarter mile that she had misjudged her 90 minutes and that they now had perhaps 40. She did not tell the men. She simply increased her pace, and she watched Elias's boots out of the corner of her eye, and when the boy stumbled, she caught his elbow without breaking stride. They reached the outer edge of the grove as the first real gust hit. The gust would have knocked all three of them down in the open meadow. Inside the grove, at their level, it split against the trunks of the great pines and passed overhead as a distant roar. Winifred felt the shelter close around them like a door swinging shut, and she understood at that moment, as she had never understood it before, that Sable Hollow was itself a vestibule, a large, slow one, the outer door before her own cabin's outer door, and that the grove had been waiting 3 centuries to serve as one. She got Orrin and Elias into her cabin at 7 in the morning. Ruth was already at the outer door before the second knock, having heard the boots on the clearing. Winifred handed the trunk to Ruth without speaking. Ruth took it and set it down and put her hands on her husband's face and did not say anything, and Orrin, whose eyes had been dry the whole walk, closed them for the first time. The cabin now held 10 souls. Winifred stopped counting after that. There was work to do. Ivy woke and saw Orrin and looked past him for her mother, and Hannah lifted her good arm, and Ivy went to it. Thomas slept on, and his fever broke sometime around 8 in the morning, though Winifred did not know that until Silas told her later. Elias sat on the crate beside the stove and did not speak for a long time, and when he did speak, he did not speak to Winifred but to Thad Rickford. And what he said was a name. Bram Halloran and Thad Rickford nodded slowly and said, "I knew Bram," and the two of them sat with that name between them for the rest of the morning. The blizzard blew through midday. By early afternoon, the wind had softened to something that could be called weather rather than assault. The stove burned low. The floor beneath their feet stayed warm. The brass thermometer on the interior wall read 69 degrees, and Winifred had stopped looking at it because it was going to hold, and she had other things to attend to. Orrin Belknap came to her sometime in the middle of that afternoon. He came without ceremony, without his hat in his hands, without a rehearsed speech. He simply crossed the room and sat down on the crate opposite her and looked at her and let her look back. His face had color in it again, though his lips were cracked and his eyelashes were still white with frost. "Ma'am." His voice was a rasp. "My son slept on this floor. My wife stood at that stove. My foreman is dead in the meadow because he chose to come help a family my crew had told 3 weeks ago could not be helped. I have been building on this frontier 29 years. I built my first cabin at 16 with my father in the Sangamon Valley. I have built 44 of them since, counting the one I built for my father before he passed. I was the man in this valley folks came to. That was the count as of 5 weeks ago." His jaw worked. "I told those folks a woman alone could not build a cabin that would hold. I told them the trees in this grove would fail as corners. I told them your floor would rot from beneath because you had buried a copper snake in the clay like a witch. I said all of that in my own voice, ma'am. Nobody put those words in my mouth." Winifred did not interrupt him. She had learned that a man like Orrin Belknap, once he had begun the sentence he had come to say, had to be allowed to finish it, because if you interrupted him halfway through, he would lose the thread and thank you and leave, and the sentence would sit in him for the rest of his life like a stone in a boot. "I am not asking you to teach me." He shook his head slowly. "I have not earned that. I am telling you that I will not be building any more cabins in this valley on my old plan. I will not be offering my crew's labor at fair rates to families who might otherwise come to you. I will not be speaking your name in any tone I have used for it before now. What I do next, I have not worked out. I know only what I will not do. I would like now to walk to the meadow with 2 men and bring Bram Halloran home to his sister, who lives in the second cabin on the north side of the settlement, and who does not yet know she is a woman with a brother to bury. That is the whole of what I came to say. I would like to leave now before I say something worse." He stood. He walked to the door of the vestibule. He paused with his hand on the inner latch, and he spoke without turning around. "The trees. Was that your idea or your husband's?" Winifred did not need to think about the answer. "Mine, Mr. Belknap. My husband gave me the copper. The trees I found here on my own 2 feet, and I asked them if they would stand as corners, and they said they would. That is as much of a partnership as any building has ever had, and it was mine to make, not his." Orrin Belknap nodded once small without turning. He went through the inner door and closed it behind him. She heard him wait the count of 10 in the vestibule because he had understood the vestibule now, even if he had come in without understanding it. Then she heard the outer door open and close. His footsteps went away down through the grove, and Winifred sat down on the crate he had vacated, and she did not weep, though she was closer to weeping than she had been in a long time. The family stayed with her 3 more nights. On the 4th morning, the cold snap broke the mercury climbing overnight from 30 below to 12 below, from 12 below to 5 above, from 5 above by mid-morning to a nearly balmy 15 above, with a low sun in a pale blue sky and the taste of ordinary winter on the air for the first time in nearly a week. They left one at a time over the course of that morning, back down through the grove toward what remained of the settlement. Each of them stopped in the doorway of the vestibule before they went. Each of them said a version of the same thing. Silas said it plainest. He stood with Thomas on one arm and the boy was already asking about his goats, and Silas looked at Winifred and he said only, "Ma'am, if you knock on our latch some night, it will open the other way." And he did not add anything else, and he did not have to. Winifred inclined her head the smallest possible bow that a Protestant woman could give another woman without kneeling, and Silas went out. Merritt and Hannah went next. Merritt's hands were bandaged in clean linen Winifred had cut and boiled the second night. Hannah's arm was wrapped from wrist to elbow. They had nowhere to go but back to Silas's cabin, whose walls now had to hold 2 families through the rest of the winter, but they did not say that. Merritt paused at the outer door and looked back at Winifred and said, "Ma'am, when spring comes and I rebuild, I would like to rebuild the way you have built, and I would like to name the design, and I would like to tell any man who asks me later that I built it after the Ashcombe plan. I will not do it if you tell me not to, but I would prefer to do it because it is honest." Winifred thought about it. She thought about the sketches she had pressed her thumbprint into. She thought about Ivy hearing the cabin breathe like a big animal. She thought about the way a building once built made an argument whether or not its builder wished to argue. "Call it the Ashcombe plan if you like, Mr. Whitcomb. That is my name and I have not used it much lately. It will not wear out from being spoken." Merritt nodded once. Hannah touched Winifred's sleeve with her good hand and did not speak because she was not yet ready to speak, and Winifred understood the touch and returned it. They went out. Ivy went last, carried in her mother's uninjured arm wrapped in Winifred's bearskin, which Winifred had told Hannah to keep for as long as the child needed it. Ivy looked back once over her mother's shoulder and lifted her small gloved hand in a solemn wave. And Winifred returned this wave because Ivy was 6, and a wave to Ivy was not the same currency it was to a grown man, and because Winifred was learning at 38 to spend the currencies she had not spent before. Ivy's fingers closed around the wave as if to catch it, and then the family was gone through the outer door into the pale winter morning. Ruth Belknap left with Elias in the early afternoon. Orrin had already gone back down the day before with the men who had helped him bring Bram Halloran up out of the meadow. Ruth did not say much at the door. She only looked at Winifred, and then she looked at the interior wall where the brass thermometer hung, and she said, "Ma'am, my husband is a difficult man to be married to, and he will be a more difficult man for a while now, because a man like him does not know what to do with the size of what has happened. But he will build a vestibule of his own. I will make sure of it, and when he is finished, he will come and ask you to look at it, and you will not have to say anything kind. You will only have to look at it and nod. That is all he will need from you." Winifred nodded. Ruth touched Elias's back, and the 2 of them went out. Winifred was alone in her cabin by 3 in the afternoon. She sat on the crate beside the stove. She did not stoke the fire. She let it burn low. She looked at the brass thermometer on the interior wall. She looked at the packed clay floor where Nathaniel's coil ran hidden beneath the stones. She looked at the 2 small slits she had cut in the interior paneling, the slow lungs she had built into her walls. She thought about the 10 people who had slept on her floor the night before last, and the way none of them had died, and she thought about Bram Halloran, whom she had not known, and who had died anyway, because a man could build a house and still not build a valley, and the valley was going to need building too, one cabin at a time over many winters. She got up at last. She fed the stove. She went outside to Juno, who was in a small shed she had built beside the cabin, and she rubbed the mule's neck for a long time and told her the mule had been patient and Winifred had noticed. She came back inside. She sat again. She banked the stove for the night. She lay down on the sleeping platform. She listened to her cabin breathe in the small, still way it had learned to breathe. And she listened past her cabin to the grove. And she listened past the grove to the valley where the wind was picking up again in the small hours, but was not going to reach any child through any wall tonight. She closed her eyes, and just before she slept, she thought with the small, clear surprise of a woman who had not expected to be surprised again in her life, that she was not lonely, that she had not been lonely for weeks, that she had come out here to be alone with her grief, and that her grief had turned without her permission and without her noticing into a room that let other people live. The wind rose, the pines took it. She slept. The snow came again the third week of December, and it came in the ordinary way, a foot in a night, and then a slow, steady add of 2 or 3 inches every second day. Nobody died. 2 more cabins in the settlement failed in small ways, one losing its chimney to ice, and the other developing a soft spot in its roof that had to be patched from beneath, and both were rebuilt to Merritt Whitcomb's adapted version of the Ashcombe plan, though Merritt himself was not yet strong enough in the hands to swing a hammer, and so he stood beside the men who were and told them where each peg went. By Christmas, 5 cabins in the valley had incorporated at least one element of what Winifred had built. 3 had vestibules, 4 had sloped ceilings, 2 had buried thermal mass in the floor, though not copper. When the second real cold snap arrived on the 3rd of January, all of them held. Nobody came up to Winifred's door that night. That was the measure she had not known she was building toward. Orrin Belknap came in the second week of January. He came alone. He carried nothing in his hands. He stood in the vestibule and waited to be let through, and when Winifred opened the inner door, he stepped in and did not sit down because he had not come to stay. "Ma'am?" His voice was flat. It was not scraped. It was flat because it had been rehearsed once and abandoned and rehearsed again. "I have finished my own vestibule. I built it with my own 2 hands. My crew did not touch it. Ruth said you would not need to say anything about it. She said I only needed to tell you it was done. That is what I came to tell you." Winifred looked at him. She looked at the man who had told the whole valley that any family who followed her was gambling their children on her pride. She looked at the man whose son was still walking around in the world with all his fingers intact, and whose foreman was under 2 feet of frozen ground at the edge of the settlement cemetery, and whose wife had come up the grove alone in a blizzard to ask a stranger to bring him home. "Mr. Belknap." Winifred kept her voice even. "If your vestibule opens outward and closes tight, and if a stranger's boot on your yard some night can find it, then it is the right vestibule. I do not need to see it. I trust the man Ruth described to me." Orrin Belknap did not answer immediately. His jaw worked. He did not meet her eyes, but he did not look away either. "There is a thing I did not say the day I came here in the blizzard," he said finally. "I did not say it because there was a boy in the room I did not want to hear it, and because I did not know how to say it plain. I would like to say it plain now. Say it. I told my son this morning that his life belongs to him, but it does not belong to him alone." He shifted his weight. "I told him that a man who has walked into a room where he was not welcome and walked out warm owes something to whoever kept the room warm. I told him that when he is grown, he is to remember which door opened to him at 17, and he is to open his own door the same way. I told him this is not a debt he owes you, ma'am. It is a debt he owes the next person who comes cold to any door he ever hangs." His jaw worked again. "That is what I did not say the day of the blizzard. That is what I came to say now." Winifred did not answer. She could not have answered without letting her voice break, and she did not want her voice to break in front of Orrin Belknap, not because he did not deserve it, but because she did not want the moment to become about her. She only nodded small, the smallest nod she had given to anyone in the valley, and Orrin Belknap nodded back and he turned and went out through the vestibule, and the outer door closed behind him with the small, clean sound of a well-fit joint. She sat down at the crate after he was gone. She looked at the floor for a long time. The winter went on. The winter was not merciful exactly, but it stopped being cruel to anyone in Sable Hollow's shadow. Ruth Belknap came up twice in February with a jar of preserves each time. Silas Whitcomb brought Thomas up in early March, and the boy stayed a whole afternoon and asked 12 questions about copper and clay, and one about whether the mule had a name. Ivy Whitcomb came in April with her mother and did not remember the night of the fire, or said she did not, and Winifred did not correct her because a child who had been given the gift of not remembering deserved to keep the gift. Spring came late that year as spring did in the Bitterroots. It did not arrive with a rush of green. It arrived in the way the frost held off for an hour longer each morning, in the way the snow melt began to hum beneath the roots of the great pines, in the way the sod on Winifred's roof began, on a warm afternoon in the second week of April, to sprout the first pale green shoots of clover and prairie grass. She sat outside on the stump she had cut for a chair in the vestibule doorway and watched the green come up on her own roof, and she thought that this was the closest she had come in 2 years and 8 months to something that was not grief. Merritt Whitcomb rebuilt his cabin that spring. He did it slowly because his hands were still stiff and because he had chosen to do it right rather than fast. He used the Ashcombe plan and his own compromises to it. He had a vestibule and a sloped ceiling and a bed of river stones in the floor where he could not afford copper. When it was done in the last week of May, he brought his family to it, and the cabin held 4 people cleanly and could hold 6 in a storm. Ivy chose her own corner of the loft. Hannah's arm had healed to a pale ripple of scar from wrist to elbow, and she used the arm without complaint, though she never again wore short sleeves in summer. The second winter came in late October of 1884. It was a milder winter than the first. Nobody in the valley died of cold that year. 2 babies were born in cabins built to the Ashcombe plan, both in February, both healthy. Orrin Belknap took on a new foreman in November, a quiet man named Peter Halloran, who was Bram's younger brother, and the 2 of them together built 3 more cabins in the valley that year. All of them with vestibules that opened outward, and all of them, Ruth told Winifred over a jar of March preserves, with the small letters AP burned into the ridge beam where the roof met the west wall. Ashcombe plan. Orrin did not tell Winifred about this himself. Ruth told her. Winifred did not visit any of the cabins. She did not need to. She only nodded at Ruth over the preserves and thanked her, and Ruth understood the thanks and returned it. The third winter came in November of 1885, and it came harder than the second, though not as hard as the first. Winifred was 40 years old that winter, and she felt it. Something in her chest had begun in the summer of 1885 to catch when she took a full breath. She did not tell anyone. She had learned in 3 years alone that a woman who lived by herself in a grove had to be careful with the information she shared about her own body, because information became worry and worry became visitors, and she did not want to be a woman whose door people knocked on because they feared for her rather than because they needed the door open for their own sake. She kept building. She built a small shed for a second mule she had bought that summer to keep Juno company, an animal she named Ash for the color of his coat. She built a low bench outside the vestibule for Ivy Whitcomb, who came up every Saturday now to sit and ask questions. She built in the fall of 1885 a small addition off the east wall of the cabin, a room no bigger than a pantry in which she kept a table and a chair, and a Bible, and the folded piece of oilcloth in which Nathaniel's copper had come west. She did not tell anyone what the small room was for. Ruth on a visit in early December saw it and did not ask, and Winifred did not explain, and Ruth understood that some rooms in a widow's house were rooms only she was meant to sit in. The catch in Winifred's chest grew worse through January of 1886. By February, she was coughing at night. She did not cough during the day when Ivy came up. She saved the coughing for the small hours when only the pines were listening and the pines had heard worse. Thad Rickford, who had appointed himself something like an older brother to her over the 2 years noticed in March. He was 51 that spring, and his right ear had lost another quarter-inch to frost over the second winter, and he did not miss much. He came up on a warm morning in April with a small bottle of dark liquid he said had been made by a Nez Perce woman he trapped near, and he did not tell Winifred what was in it, but he set it on her table and he said, "Ma'am, you take a spoonful of this when the cough comes at night, and you do not ask me what is in it, because I do not fully know either, but I trust the hand it came from." She took the bottle. She thanked him. She did not that night, or any night, take a spoonful, because she was not a woman who took medicine from bottles, whose contents she did not know. But she kept the bottle on the shelf above the stove, and she looked at it sometimes. And it steadied her in the way any object steadies a person when it has been given in good faith. The summer of 1886 was hot. The grove kept its shade as the grove always kept its shade. But the meadow beyond browned early, and the creek dropped 6 inches from its June level by the end of August. Winifred worked less that summer than she had in any summer since coming to Sable Hollow. She spent more time on the stump chair outside the vestibule. She spent more time in the pantry room with the door closed. She wrote a letter to Nathaniel's father, whom she had not written in 18 months, and she told him about the copper coil under the floor and about Silas Whitcomb's wife, who had called her cabin a lung, and about a girl named Ivy who had heard the cabin breathe. She did not tell him about the catch in her chest. He was 81 that summer. He did not need the worry. The letter took 9 weeks to reach Rutland. The reply came back in mid-November in Nathaniel's father's shaking hand on a single sheet of stationery so thin she could see the light through it. It said, "Only Winnie. Your husband would have known it worked before you lit the fire. The rest is for you. I am proud of the daughter he chose." She folded the letter into the oilcloth with the last few feet of copper she had never used. She sat with it a long time. The third real cold snap of Winifred's time in Sable Hollow came in the second week of December 1886. It was not as long as the first great freeze, only 2 nights, but it was as sharp. The mercury outside her door dropped to 31 below on the second night, 1 degree short of the Great Freeze's low mark of 1883. Inside her cabin, the brass thermometer read 69 degrees as it always did, because she had built a cabin that would read 69 degrees whether she was inside it or not. She was not on the second night of that snap entirely well. The cough had grown from a small catch into a rasp that would not let her lie flat. She had banked the stove earlier than usual. She sat on the crate beside it in Nathaniel's coat and the shawl he had bought her the winter she had turned 23, and she watched the flame low in the firebox, and she thought about how strange it was that a fire this small could keep a room this warm, and how the whole trick of survival in this country was to understand that small things kept when they were done well and big things burned out. Ruth Belknap knocked on the vestibule at 9 in the evening. Winifred had not expected her. Ruth had walked up the grove alone with a lantern because Orrin was down at Peter Halloran's cabin, helping seal a chimney, and Ruth had woken in the middle of dinner with a feeling she could not name, and had put her coat on and gone up. She stood in the vestibule, and Winifred opened the inner door, and Ruth looked at her once and set her lantern down and did not ask any questions. "I will stay tonight," Ruth said, "if you would like company." Winifred did not answer for a moment. She sat back down on the crate. She looked at Ruth Belknap, who was 50 that year, and who had walked up a mile of grove in a snap to sit with her. "I would like company," she said finally. Yes. Ruth stayed. She sat on the sleeping platform. She did not lie down. She fed the stove when it needed feeding. She did not press Winifred to speak because she understood by now that Winifred did not need to be pressed, that the words would come or they would not come, and either way, the room would breathe. Sometime after midnight, Winifred looked at Ruth across the low light of the firebox. "Ruth, I do not think I am going to see the spring." Ruth did not answer immediately. Then she said quietly, "I know. I have known since June." Winifred nodded small. She looked at the floor where the copper ran. "There is a paper in the pantry room on the table folded inside a Bible. It says who gets what. It is not much. Juno should go to Thomas Whitcomb. He is old enough now to want a mule of his own. Ash should go to Elias. He wanted a horse, but a mule is what he can afford to feed. The cabin should go to Ivy when she is grown enough to want a room to sit in alone. Until then, whoever needs the door open on a cold night should know the door is open. That is written down too." Ruth nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry because Winifred had not cried, and Ruth understood the courtesy of matching the room. "I would like the tree," Winifred said after a while. She was speaking now to the fire, not to Ruth. "The saplings at the north end of the meadow. The straightest one. I would like to be under the straightest one. No stone, just the sapling above me. In 50 years, it will be a tree that will do the same work these ones did for me." Ruth wrote it down on a piece of butcher paper she had brought with her because Ruth was a woman who came prepared to the room she chose to sit in. She folded the paper into her coat pocket. They did not speak much after that. Sometime near dawn, Winifred laid her head against the wall log of the eastern corner, the pine trunk that formed the northeast joint of her cabin, and she closed her eyes. Ruth watched her breathing get smaller. Ruth did not move. She went at 7 in the morning on the 14th of December, 1886. The last thing she said aloud was Nathaniel's name spoken so quietly that Ruth was not certain later whether she had heard it or imagined it. The brass thermometer on the interior wall read 69 degrees. The stove was banked. The great pines held. Ruth waited until 8 to open the outer door. She walked down through the grove herself alone, and she reached the settlement, and she went first to Silas Whitcomb's cabin, because Silas was the one who had been closest to Winifred, and because Ivy would need to be told by someone who knew how to tell her. She did not have to explain much. Silas saw Ruth's face at his door and understood. The men buried Winifred under the straightest sapling at the north end of the meadow 4 days later. Once the snap had broken and the ground had softened enough to open. Orrin Belknap did the digging himself, though his back was not what it had been. Thad Rickford stood at the edge of the hole with his hat off, and both his ears were black at the tips now, and he did not say anything for a long time. When he did speak, it was only to say she built a door that did not know how to shut, and he did not explain what he meant, because the people standing around the hole knew what he meant. Ivy Whitcomb was 9 that winter. She placed a small copper coin on top of the earth after the men had finished. She had asked her father for the coin the night before, and he had given it without asking why. She did not tell anyone what the coin was for. She only stood a moment beside the sapling, and she put her hand on its thin trunk, and she said into the cold air so quietly that only her father heard her, "Thank you for the butter," and she walked back to the settlement with her hand in his. The cabin stood. Ruth Belknap fed the stove every third day through the rest of that winter, and Silas fed it the other days, and the door opened for anyone who came to it. 2 men from a wagon train that got lost in the Bitterroots in early February found the cabin by the smoke and stayed a night and left in the morning with dry boots and a sketch of a vestibule on birch bark that Ruth had drawn from memory, pressing her own thumbprint into the corner, because she had watched Winifred do it enough times to know the mark belonged there. Ivy came of age in 1893. She was 16. She had grown into a tall, thin girl with her mother's straight hair and her father's freckled hands, and she was already known in the valley as a builder, though she had built nothing of her own yet. She took possession of the cabin that spring. She moved a few things in. She left most of the things Winifred had kept where she had kept them. She did not open the small pantry room off the east wall for a full year, because she understood that some rooms were entered only when the person entering was ready for what the room was for. She opened it in April of 1894 on a warm afternoon, and she found the folded oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth, she found the last 4 feet of Nathaniel Ashcombe's copper tubing, and she found the Bible. And inside the Bible, she found the recipe for pitch and ash sealant that Winifred had copied out in her own hand from a workshop notebook in Rutland in 1875. Ivy read the recipe. She refolded the paper. She put it back inside the Bible. She sat in the pantry room for an hour. Then she went outside and fed the stove and got to work. The valley called Ivy Whitcomb the second Ashcombe, though her name was Whitcomb, and though she never accepted the title in words. She built her first cabin in the summer of 1895 on a piece of ground her father gave her a mile north of the settlement, and she built it with a vestibule that opened outward and a sloped ceiling angled inward 2 degrees and a bed of river stones under the floor. Because copper was expensive, and she built it in 11 weeks, working alone except for Thomas Whitcomb, her older brother, who helped her raise the ridge poles because a person cannot raise a ridge pole alone. She pressed her thumbprint into the corner of the birch bark sketch she drew for herself before she began, small and deliberate, though she could not have said why she started doing it. The cabin Winifred built in Sable Hollow stood into the 1920s. It was still standing when the last of the men who had known Winifred died, and it was standing when the first grandchildren of the men who had known her came up the grove to see it. And it was standing in the summer of 1934, when a young forester with the newly formed Civilian Conservation Corps mapped Sable Hollow for the government and marked the cabin on his map as notable frontier structure condition sound. The sod on the roof was 3 inches deep by then, and the vestibule door still opened outward, and the brass thermometer on the interior wall still hung where Winifred had nailed it, though the mercury had frozen and split the glass sometime around 1912, and nobody had replaced it. The sapling at the north end of the meadow grew into a pine 47 feet tall by 1934. It was straight as she had wanted. Nobody planted a stone at its base. Nobody needed to. The children who grew up in the valley all knew the story, and they knew the tree, and they knew that a widow from Vermont was buried beneath it, and they knew, though nobody ever quite said it in these words, that the tree above her had done the same work she had done, which was to stand where it was needed and let other things live in its shelter. The grove itself thickened in some places and thinned in others as the decades passed. New pines took root in the gaps between the elders. Moss climbed higher on the trunks that formed the 4 corners of Winifred's cabin, and by the middle of the 20th century, those corners were as much moss as bark, and the walls of the cabin had settled a full inch on their south side, but they had not settled unevenly because Winifred had put them on gravel below the frost line. And gravel below the frost line was a promise a builder made to a building that a building kept in return. There was no plaque, there was no carved marker on the door. There was only the whisper of pine needles overhead, and beneath them a cabin that a woman had built in the fall of 1883, by listening first and cutting second, and beyond the cabin, a valley of small, imperfect versions of the same design that had kept people alive through the coldest winter any of them ever remembered. And beyond the valley, the memory of a name that a whole country of anonymous widows had never been given the chance to say aloud, but that Winifred Ashcombe had said once in a clearing in Sable Hollow, while a boy named Thomas ate a biscuit and looked at a coiled length of yellow rope, and it was enough. It had always been enough. The wind came down the Bitterroots as it always had. The great pines took it as they had for 3 centuries. The cabin held. She had kept the room warm. The rest was for whoever came next.